My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 months ago my parents called me crying because my younger brother's terrible investment decisions had bankrupted the entire family. They needed me to save them, not wanted, needed. Because the golden child they'd spent 25 years praising and funding through failure after failure had finally failed so spectacularly that he'd taken their retirement savings and their house down with him. They'd given him over $300,000 across failed businesses, ignored every warning I gave them about his latest scheme, and now they were facing foreclosure and asking me, the daughter they barely acknowledged, to fix it with my money. Welcome back to Calm Drama Story. This is about golden children who can do no wrong, invisible daughters who can do nothing right, and what happens when the family that never valued you suddenly needs you to be the hero. Hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me if you would have helped, and let's get into this. Now let me tell you about 25 years of being the backup child, and what I said when they called asking me to save them from betting everything on my brother. Let me tell you what it's like to grow up in a house where your sibling can do no wrong, and you can do nothing right, no matter how hard you try. I was born in 1989, and my brother Marcus was born 3 years later in 1992. And from the moment he arrived, the dynamic in our family shifted in ways I was too young to understand, but old enough to feel. Marcus was special from day one, or at least that's what my parents seemed to believe. This beautiful, charming baby who smiled at everyone and made people light up just by existing in a room. I was the serious older sister, the responsible one, the child who colored inside the lines and followed rules and got good grades without being asked. My parents loved me, I think, in that obligatory way parents love all their children. But they adored Marcus in a way that was different, more enthusiastic, more forgiving, more willing to see potential where there were just empty promises and big talk. The pattern started early and never stopped. When I was 8 and Marcus was 5, I won a school-wide writing contest and got my story published in the local newspaper. My parents said that was nice and put the clipping on the fridge. When Marcus scored a goal in his first ever soccer game that same week, they threw a party and invited the whole family and talked about it for months, like he'd won the World Cup. When I was in 6th grade and got straight A's for the 3rd year in a row, my parents said they expected nothing less, given how much time I spent studying. When Marcus barely passed 7th grade 2 years later, because he'd spent more time being class clown than doing homework, my parents said he was just bored with traditional education and needed to find his passion. I learned early that achievement was expected from me, and excused in Marcus, that my successes were baseline requirements, while his were celebrated like miracles, even when they were objectively minor or came after multiple failures. High school was more of the same. I was in honors classes, part of the debate team, volunteered at a local nonprofit, worked part-time at a coffee shop to save money for college. Marcus played basketball, barely maintained a C average, got suspended twice for pranks that my parents thought were hilarious examples of his creative spirit. When I got into a top state university with a full academic scholarship covering tuition, room, and board, my parents said congratulations, and asked why I hadn't applied to any Ivy League schools if I was so smart. When Marcus got accepted to a mid-tier state school with mediocre SAT scores and a GPA that barely qualified, they threw a graduation party, bought him a used car, and talked about how proud they were that he was going to college, despite not being book smart like his sister. The implication was clear. My intelligence was a given, maybe even a limitation because it made me boring, while Marcus's charm and personality would take him further in life than grades ever could. College was where the real divergence started, where my path and Marcus's path split so dramatically that it should have been obvious to anyone paying attention that we were headed to very different destinations. I went to university, declared a double major in economics and mathematics because I loved the logic and precision of numbers, joined clubs and made friends, and worked part-time jobs to minimize my loans, even though I had a scholarship. I graduated summa cum laude after 4 years, got a job as a junior analyst at a consulting firm in the city, started building a career and a life that felt stable and promising. Marcus lasted 2 years at college before dropping out, calling my parents from his dorm room to explain that he'd discovered his real passion was day trading and entrepreneurship, that traditional education was holding him back, that he could make more money trading stocks than he'd ever make with a college degree. My parents, instead of telling him to finish school, or at least have a backup plan, said they supported his dreams and wired him $50,000 from their savings to set up his trading account and rent an apartment near the stock exchange. I found out about the $50,000 at Thanksgiving that year when Marcus showed up driving a new Audi and wearing an expensive watch, talking about his wins in the market like he was the next Warren Buffett. I was 25, living in a studio apartment with furniture from IKEA, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic I'd bought used, working 60-hour weeks to prove myself at the consulting firm. My parents asked Marcus about his trades over dinner, hung on every word of his explanations about bull markets and shorts and options that honestly sounded more like gambling than investing. They asked me how work was, and when I said I'd been promoted to analyst from junior analyst, they said that was nice, and went back to asking Marcus about cryptocurrency, because he'd just started trading Bitcoin and thought it was going to make him rich. The promotion had come with a 20% raise, and more responsibility and recognition from my bosses that I was doing exceptional work. My parents literally said, "That's nice," and changed the subject. Marcus lost the $50,000 within 18 months, all of it. He called my parents crying, explaining that the market had turned against him, that he'd made some bad bets, that he needed time to recover, and maybe a little more capital to make back what he'd lost. My parents had a choice in that moment. They could tell him that day trading wasn't working and he needed to get a real job, or they could double down on their faith in him and give him more money. They chose to double down. They gave him another $30,000, which he lost in 6 months. Then another $20,000, which he lost in 4 months. By the time I was 28 and Marcus was 25, my parents had given him over $100,000 in investments in his trading career, and he had nothing to show for it except debt and a string of losses that would have convinced any rational person that maybe this wasn't his calling. Meanwhile, I'd been promoted twice more, was now a senior analyst making a good salary, had bought a small one-bedroom condo in a nice neighborhood, had built up a solid retirement account and emergency savings. My parents came to my condo warming party, stayed for an hour, and spent most of that hour on the phone with Marcus, who was dealing with some crisis related to his latest investment loss. They left early because Marcus needed them to co-sign for a new apartment, since his credit was too damaged from failed ventures to rent on his own. I stood in my condo that I'd saved for and bought myself, and watched them leave to help Marcus with his latest failure. And I realized with perfect clarity that nothing I accomplished would ever matter as much to them as Marcus's next big idea. The crypto phase came next, and it was somehow even worse than the day trading. Marcus called my parents with enormous enthusiasm about this revolutionary technology that was going to change the world, that was going to make early investors incredibly wealthy, that was his chance to finally hit it big and prove everyone who doubted him wrong. My parents didn't doubt him. They never had. They took out a home equity line of credit on their house that had been paid off for 5 years, and gave Marcus $150,000 to start a cryptocurrency investment fund. He was going to manage other people's money, take a percentage of the profits, build a client base, and create real wealth. It sounded legitimate enough that I almost believed it might work. Almost thought maybe Marcus had finally found something that matched his risk tolerance and his confidence. Until I looked into the firm he'd registered and realized it was just him in a rented office with no clients and no infrastructure, and no real plan beyond hoping crypto prices would keep going up forever. The fund existed for 2 years before it collapsed. Marcus had a few small clients, mostly friends and family who trusted him because he was charming and enthusiastic and convinced. Made some early gains when Bitcoin was surging, and then lost everything when the market crashed. He lost his clients' money. He lost the $150,000 my parents had given him, and he lost the additional $50,000 they'd wired him 6 months into the venture, when he said he just needed more capital to weather the volatility. By the time I was 30 and Marcus was 27, my parents had given him over $300,000 total across his various business ventures, had $150,000 in debt on their house that should have been paid off, and Marcus was living in a tiny apartment, working part-time at a tech company, while he figured out his next move. I'd been promoted to director at my firm by then, was making solid 6 figures, had paid off my student loans and my condo, had started traveling and dating, and building a life that felt full and successful in ways I was proud of. I went to my parents' house for dinner one Sunday and mentioned casually that I'd been promoted again, that I was now one of the youngest directors in my company's history, that I was leading a team of 15 analysts and managing multi-million-dollar client accounts. My dad said congratulations and asked if I wanted more potatoes. My mom asked if I was dating anyone because I wasn't getting any younger, and maybe I should think about settling down before my career made me too independent for a relationship. Then Marcus called, and they spent 45 minutes on speakerphone while he explained his newest business idea, a tech startup that was going to revolutionize social media by doing something that honestly sounded exactly like what Facebook and Twitter already did, but with different branding. They were excited. They asked questions. They talked about how brilliant he was. They asked how much money he needed to get started. He needed $200,000. They didn't have $200,000. They'd already borrowed against the house, and their retirement savings were mostly tied up in investments they couldn't liquidate without penalties. So they took out a second mortgage on the house, a massive loan that would take them 15 years to pay off, and they gave Marcus $200,000 to start his social media company. I found out about it when I went to visit and saw the paperwork on the kitchen counter, the mortgage documents showing they now owed $350,000 on a house that was worth maybe $400,000 in a good market. I asked my dad if he was sure about this, if he really thought it was wise to put the house at risk for Marcus's startup, and he looked at me like I'd insulted his son, told me that Marcus was going to be huge one day and that smart investors get in early, and that maybe if I'd taken more risks in my career, I'd understand that sometimes you have to believe in people and their vision. I was the director of a team at a major consulting firm, managing millions in client assets, and my father was telling me I didn't understand risk because I'd chosen stable employment over starting companies that failed spectacularly. I stopped trying to warn them. I stopped trying to point out that Marcus had never succeeded at anything he'd started, that every venture had ended in losses, that maybe it was time to accept he wasn't cut out for entrepreneurship. They didn't want to hear it. In their minds, Marcus was one good idea away from massive success, and I was the boring daughter who didn't dream big enough to see his potential. The social media startup failed before it even launched a product. Marcus burned through the $200,000 in 18 months on office space and salaries for friends he'd hired, and marketing consultants, and all the infrastructure of a company that never actually had users or revenue. The company folded. Marcus had nothing to show for it. My parents had a second mortgage they could barely afford on their retirement budget. And through all of this, through every failure and every loss, and every time Marcus came back asking for more money to fund his next idea, my parents never once asked me for financial advice, despite the fact that I literally managed investments for a living. Not once. They never asked if I thought Marcus's ventures were sound. They never asked if I could review his business plans, or his financial projections, or his risk assessments. They never treated me like someone whose professional opinion might be valuable when it came to deciding whether to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in their son's unproven ideas. I could have told them that every single venture was doomed from the start, based on basic market analysis and risk assessment. I could have saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of financial strain, but they never asked, because asking me would have meant acknowledging that I knew something Marcus didn't. And in their minds, that was impossible, because Marcus was the special one, the one with vision and drive. while I was just the safe, boring daughter who'd never taken a real risk in her life. When I was 32, I got engaged to a guy I'd been dating for 2 years, a software engineer who was kind and funny and treated me like I mattered in ways my family never had. We had a small engagement party at a nice restaurant, invited close friends and family, and I was genuinely excited to celebrate with the people I loved. My parents came late because Marcus had a business meeting that ran long, and they'd waited to drive with him. They stayed for an hour, barely talked to my fiancé, spent most of dinner on their phones texting with Marcus about whatever crisis he was dealing with. They left before dessert because Marcus needed their advice on something urgent. They forgot to congratulate us. Just completely forgot. Walked out of the restaurant without saying anything about the engagement or the wedding or being happy for me. I sat at that table surrounded by friends who were excited and supportive and genuinely happy for me. And I realized my parents would never be those people for me, would never prioritize me or my achievements or my happiness the way they prioritized Marcus and his endless string of failures. We got married the next year, a small ceremony with close friends and chosen family. And my parents came, but complained the whole time that it was the same weekend as some tech conference Marcus wanted to attend, and he was missing it to be at my wedding. Like his presence was a sacrifice he was making, rather than a basic expectation of being my brother. My mother gave a speech at the reception about how proud she was of both her children, spent 3 sentences on me and my career and my marriage, and spent 5 minutes talking about Marcus's resilience and vision and how excited she was about his future prospects. At my wedding. During the mother of the bride speech, I listened to her talk about Marcus's bright future while standing next to the man I'd just married, and I made a decision that I was done trying to earn my parents' approval or recognition, or even basic acknowledgement that I existed, as more than the backdrop to Marcus's story. The real estate investment scheme came when Marcus was 32 and I was 35, and it was the catastrophic finale to 25 years of bad decisions, enabled by my parents' blind faith in their golden child. Marcus called me first this time, which was unusual because we barely spoke unless we were forced to at family events, and he was more excited than I'd heard him in years. He'd met some investors who were doing ground floor real estate development, buying land cheap and building luxury condos, and the returns were insane, 40% annually, completely legitimate, verified by accountants and lawyers. He was getting in early, and he wanted to bring family in on the opportunity because he felt bad that Mom and Dad had supported him through rough patches and never gotten returns on their faith in him. This was going to change everything. This was his chance to make them wealthy, to show them their investment in him had been worth it, to finally prove he could succeed as big as they'd always believed he could. I told him it sounded like a scam. 40% annual returns on real estate were not normal or sustainable. He got defensive, said I was always so negative about his ideas, that I'd never supported him because I was jealous of his ambition. I told him I wasn't jealous. I was concerned. And if he was smart, he'd run the opportunity by a financial advisor before investing anything significant. He said he didn't need a financial advisor because he'd done his research and the investors had proven track records, and I just couldn't see opportunity when it was right in front of me because I was so risk-averse. I told him to be careful. He hung up. 2 weeks later, my mother called to tell me excitedly that Marcus had found an amazing investment opportunity and they were going to invest their retirement savings with him and also co-sign a business loan so he could invest more because the minimum buy-in was high, but the returns would set them all up for life. I begged her not to do it. I explained that 40% returns were not realistic, that it sounded exactly like the kind of scheme that collapses and leaves everyone broke, that they couldn't afford to lose their retirement money. She said I was being unsupportive, like always, that Marcus had really done his homework this time, that the investors were legitimate and had shown him documentation and references. And why couldn't I just be happy for my brother, instead of always assuming he was going to fail. I said I'd assumed he was going to fail because he'd failed at everything he'd ever tried, and this sounded worse than all the previous failures combined. She said I was cruel and jealous, and maybe I needed to examine why I was so threatened by Marcus's success. I told her he hadn't succeeded yet, and she was risking everything on a scheme that was almost certainly fraud. She said they'd made their decision, and she'd called to inform me, not to ask my permission. They invested everything. 6 months later, it all collapsed. The investors disappeared. The properties didn't exist. The whole thing was a Ponzi scheme that had been operating for 3 years, paying out early investors with money from new investors, and it came crashing down when the state attorney general started investigating and the founders fled the country. Marcus lost the $200,000 he'd invested, which was money from the business loan my parents had co-signed. My parents lost their entire retirement savings, $400,000 they'd spent 30 years building. And because they'd co-signed the loan, they were now on the hook for $200,000 in debt that Marcus couldn't pay because he was broke. The bank started foreclosure proceedings on their house because they couldn't make the payments on the second mortgage plus the new loan payments. Everything they'd built over 40 years of working and saving was gone because they'd bet it all on Marcus. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was making dinner in my condo. My husband was setting the table, and my phone rang with my mom's number. I almost didn't answer because we'd barely spoken since the argument about the investment, but something made me pick up. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. That gasping, sobbing that means something terrible has happened, and I thought someone had died. In a way, something had. Their financial life was dead. She explained through tears that the investment was fraud, that they'd lost everything, that Marcus had lost everything, that the bank was taking the house and they had nowhere to go and no savings to start over. She said she didn't know what to do. She said they needed help. She said, could I please, please help them, because they were desperate and didn't have anyone else to turn to. I asked where Marcus was, what he was doing to fix this since it was his investment that had destroyed them. She said Marcus was staying with friends, trying to restart his career, that he felt terrible about what happened, but he was a victim too, that the investors had fooled him just like they'd fooled everyone else. I said Marcus had ignored every warning about the scheme being too good to be true, had convinced them to invest money they couldn't afford to lose, and was now apparently too busy restarting his career to help the parents whose house was being foreclosed on because they'd co-signed his loan. She said I didn't understand, that Marcus was suffering too, that he'd lost everything just like they had. I said the difference was Marcus had been losing money his whole life, and they'd always bailed him out, and now they needed him to bail them out, and he was nowhere to be found. She shifted tactics then, stopped defending Marcus and started asking for help directly. Could I loan them money to catch up on the mortgage and the loan payments? Could they stay with me while they figured things out? Could I do something, anything, because they were my parents and they needed me? I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. That feeling you get when you realize someone is asking you to save them from a disaster they created, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge their role in creating it. I asked her how much money they needed. She said probably $200,000 to catch up on everything and buy time to sell the house in a controlled way, instead of losing it to foreclosure. $200,000. The same amount they'd given Marcus for a social media company that never launched. Half of what they'd given him total over the years across all his failed ventures. I told her no. I told her I didn't have $200,000 sitting around to loan to family. Which wasn't exactly true, because I'd saved aggressively and invested wisely, and had built a comfortable financial cushion. But it also wasn't a lie, because I wasn't going to drain my savings to fix their mistake. She said she wasn't asking me to give it to them, just to loan it. They'd pay me back eventually when they got back on their feet. I asked how they planned to pay me back when they had no retirement savings. no jobs that would generate that kind of income, and were about to lose their house. She didn't have an answer. She just cried more and said they were desperate, that I was their daughter, that family helps family in times of crisis. I said, "You mean the family that forgot my birthday 3 years in a row? The family that left my engagement party early because Marcus had a business meeting? The family that spent my wedding reception talking about Marcus's bright future? That family?" She got quiet. Then she said that was unfair, that they'd always loved me, that just because they were excited about Marcus's ventures didn't mean they didn't care about me. I said it meant exactly that for 25 years they'd made it crystal clear that Marcus's failures mattered more to them than my successes, that his potential was more important than my reality, that his dreams deserved hundreds of thousands of dollars of support, while my actual achievements barely warranted a congratulations. I said I'd spent my entire life being the invisible daughter, the backup child, the one who was expected to succeed without support, while Marcus was funded through failure after failure. And I was done. I was done trying to earn recognition I'd never get. I was done being the reliable one who didn't need attention. I was done pretending that their treatment of me and Marcus had been anywhere close to equal or fair. My mother said I was being cruel, that they were in crisis and I was bringing up old hurts instead of helping them in their time of need. I said their time of need was a direct result of ignoring every warning I'd given them about Marcus's ventures, that I'd tried to stop them from making this exact mistake, and they'd called me unsupportive and jealous, and now they wanted me to fix it with the money I'd saved by being the boring daughter who made responsible choices. She asked if I was really going to let them lose their house, let them become homeless in their 60s because I was angry about the past. I said I wasn't going to let them do anything. They'd already done it to themselves by betting everything on Marcus. I said there were assistance programs for people facing foreclosure, credit counseling services, options for downsizing and rebuilding. But those options didn't include me draining my savings to bail them out. The conversation ended with her crying and saying she couldn't believe I'd turned my back on them like this, that she'd raised me better, that family was supposed to stick together. I said family was supposed to show up for each other consistently, not just when they needed money, and hung up. I sat in my kitchen with my husband looking at me with concern, and I waited to feel guilty or conflicted or uncertain about my decision. But I didn't feel any of those things. I just felt clear. After 35 years of being the daughter they didn't value, I wasn't going to become the daughter who saved them from the consequences of valuing the wrong child. I didn't give them money. I didn't offer to let them move in with me. I didn't co-sign new loans or help them negotiate with the bank or do any of the things a good daughter might do for parents in crisis. I told them about resources they could access, gave them the number for a HUD-approved housing counselor and a nonprofit credit counseling service. And then I stepped back and let them figure it out, the way I'd been figuring out my own life since I was old enough to understand that I'd never be the priority in that family. 3 months later, they'd lost the house to foreclosure, sold what possessions they could, and moved into a small 2-bedroom rental in a cheaper part of town. My mother sent me the address in a text with no other message. I didn't respond. 6 months after that, I heard through a cousin that my parents were telling extended family I'd abandoned them in their time of need, that I was wealthy enough to help, but too selfish to care about my own parents, that they couldn't believe they'd raised a daughter who'd turn out so cold and heartless. The cousin asked me gently if there was more to the story, if maybe there were reasons I hadn't helped that the family should know about. I told her the whole history, the 25 years of watching my parents fund Marcus's failures while ignoring my successes, the hundreds of thousands they'd given him that they now needed me to replace, the warnings I'd given that they'd ignored because I was the boring daughter who didn't understand vision. The cousin said she understood and that she was sorry my parents had treated me that way. And word slowly spread through the family about what had really happened. Some relatives took my side, saying they'd watched the favoritism for years, and it wasn't fair to expect me to fix a problem I'd tried to prevent. Others said family was family, and I should help regardless of the past. I didn't argue with either group. I just kept living my life, kept doing my job, kept building the future I'd worked for. My parents and I barely speak now. They send cards on Christmas and my birthday, brief messages about how they're doing. No acknowledgement of everything that happened, or any apology for how they treated me. Marcus is working at another tech startup, apparently learning from his mistakes, according to the last update my mother sent, though she didn't mention whether he was helping them financially, or if he was still focused on his own career recovery, while they dealt with the aftermath of his choices. I'm 38 now, 3 years past that phone call, and I've built a life I'm genuinely proud of. I made partner at my firm, lead a division of 40 people, manage 9-figure portfolios for clients who trust my judgment and value my expertise. I have a husband who sees me and values me and treats my achievements like they matter. I have friends who show up for me consistently, who celebrate my wins and support me through challenges, who've proven over years that they care about me for who I am and not for what I can do for them. I have enough money saved and invested that I could retire early if I wanted to, could travel the world or start a second career or do any of the things that financial security makes possible when you build it carefully over decades. I didn't get any of that from my parents. I got it by being the daughter they overlooked, the one who had to build everything herself because no one was going to hand it to her or fund her dreams or believe in her potential enough to invest in her future. My parents taught me a valuable lesson, even if it wasn't the one they meant to teach. They taught me that other people's faith in you is worth nothing if it's not backed up by action. That potential without execution is just expensive dreaming. That betting everything on charisma and confidence instead of proven results is a recipe for disaster. They taught me that the golden child isn't always golden, that sometimes the boring, responsible kid who just shows up and does the work is the one who actually succeeds. They taught me that family isn't about who believes in you most enthusiastically. It's about who shows up consistently, who values your actual achievements instead of your imagined potential, who treats you like you matter, even when you're not asking them for anything. They taught me all of that by being the perfect example of what family shouldn't be. I don't regret not helping them. I don't regret letting them face the consequences of betting everything on Marcus while ignoring the daughter who actually built something stable and successful. I don't regret protecting the financial security I worked 30 years to create instead of draining it to fix a problem I tried to warn them about. Some people might call that cold. Some people might say I should have been the bigger person, should have helped my parents regardless of how they treated me, should have separated their current need from their past behavior. But I learned a long time ago that you can't separate those things. That current need is almost always the result of past behavior, and that people who never valued you when they didn't need you don't suddenly deserve your sacrifice when they do. My parents made their choice when they poured hundreds of thousands into Marcus while barely acknowledging me. They made their choice when they ignored my warnings because I was too risk-averse to see Marcus's vision. They made their choice when they showed up late to my engagement party and left early from my wedding and forgot my birthday and treated every achievement I earned like it was just what they expected from the boring daughter. I made my choice when I built a life and a career and a financial future without their support or recognition or belief. And I made my choice again when they called asking me to save them from the disaster they'd created by betting everything on the golden child, who turned out to be fool's gold. I chose me. After 35 years of them choosing Marcus, I chose myself. And I'm not sorry.